Okay, welcome back. It's my pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Erik Villard. I've known Erik a long time from our work together at CMH, Center of Military History upstairs in DC, Fort McNair. So Erik is a historian at the U.S. Army Center of Military History, which is at Fort McNair. And he is a digital historian and a Vietnam War specialist. He received BAs in history and English literature from Occidental College in California, and an MA and Ph.D. in history at the University of Washington. Erik's most recent book is Combat Operations Staying the Course, October 1967 to September 1968, which was published by the U.S. Army Center of Military History. So we welcome Dr. Villard to our program. Thank you.
All right, thank you all for being here, and for those who are joining in virtually. I hope you will find this enlightening. Hopefully, you maybe learn a few new things, have a little conversation at the end. What I thought to do today is, because the theme of our conference is memory in the Vietnam War, is to look at, in particular, 3 events from the Tet Offensive, the 1968 Tet Offensive, which appears in my book, and that's kind of my special thing, has been forever. I was born during Tet, so I'm a Tet baby. So I'm going to talk about 3 issues, because if you quiz your general population and say, what do you know about the Tet Offensive? I think these 3 would probably register. I'm not sure you'd go actually far beyond these 3, but these 3 probably people have heard about in one way or another. So I wanted to talk a little about maybe what we think we know or we remember isn't quite exactly what happened. So we will start with the big one. Probably the most famous photo, certainly the second half of the 20th century, possibly all of the 20th century, the Eddie Adams photo that he took of Brigadier General Luan, who is the head of the South Vietnam's National Police. And here, this is during the Tet Offensive in the Cho Lan district, 1 February 1968, where he basically summarily executes a Viet Cong agent. And Eddie Adams was there, takes a series of pictures, culminating, well, he took 1 or 2 after this, but this is the famous photo. There's also, again, a film of this. So Eddie Adams received the Pulitzer Prize the next year for this photograph. Throughout his life, he was always ambivalent about this photo because it catapulted him to international fame, but it also overshadowed everything else he ever did. I feel, in a way, Joe Galloway, a dear friend of mine who's since passed, I feel sort of the same way about LZ X-ray. Like, Joe did a lot of things in life, but that's all people remember him for. At any rate, this is sort of the same situation. And of course, and also later in life, Eddie Adams felt quite a bit of remorse towards General Luan, who he felt that this photo also sort of ruined Luan's life. So, what is the dominant narrative? And I'll just go through this quickly. I think there's sort of generally about 5 points. If you quiz your average person what they know. So this dominant narrative goes something like this. The man that Luan killed that day was a guy named Villard, which is an alias. He was the senior officer in a Viet Cong sapper group, sometimes known as the F-100 or the C-10 Sapper Battalion in Saigon. So that's who he killed. Second point, Villard had just killed a large number of civilians, between 7 and 34, depending on which account you have, and had blood on his hands, like literally, had blood on his hands and legs. Third, the family that Villard allegedly killed belonged to one of General Luan's close family friends. In fact, Luan was the grandfather to the children that this person assassinated. 4, Belop, when apprehended, bragged about the killings, was unrepentant, was defiant until his death a few minutes later. And then the 5th point, when asked about what he had, to General Lewan, what he had just done after killing this guy, Lewan basically says, "Oh, that was, Belop. He was the guy who murdered my friend and his family, and that's why I killed him." So my research indicates that basically none of that is true. Okay, so let's sort of walk through that and discuss that. A little bit of backstory first. So General Lewan, you see here on the right. General Lewan was born in Hue in central Vietnam, joined the Vietnamese National Army in 1951 when the French were still here. But then when South Vietnam becomes independent, 1955, he joins the Air Force. So he spends the next 10 years in the Air Force. And his good friend, Nguyen Cao Ky, rises through the ranks, ends up becoming the head of the South Vietnamese Air Force, Ky does, then prime minister and later the first vice president of South Vietnam. So he is literally, Lewan is literally his wingman. I mean, they flew combat missions together, so they're very close. So that's one thing to keep in mind. So in 1965, when Ky becomes prime minister, Lewan shifts over to the security services. In 1966, he becomes the director of the National Police. So that's why he shifts. So if you see earlier pictures, he's got the Air Force uniform, but here he's director of National Police. In Saigon, it's an important job because, Saigon, a city of 2 million people, in South Vietnam, a nation of like 15 million. It is the center of everything. So the other person, a little bit of the backstory on the left, Tet Quang. Okay, Quang was born in central Vietnam, received his Buddhist training in Hue, like Lewan, and in the early 60s, became very involved in the Buddhist political protest movement against the government, for their sort of pro-Catholic, anti-Buddhist policies. So he's in Hue at this time. And in 1966, actually is one of the leaders of, you may have heard of this, the Buddhist uprising. There was, massive demonstrations, Da Nang and Hue. Tet Quang was one of the leaders of this. And the South Vietnamese authorities, after they suppressed the rebellion, move him down to Saigon to keep an eye on him. So that's when Tet Quang becomes attached to the Ang Quang Pagoda in Saigon. And that's where he remains for the rest of his life. He passed away in 2019. I mean, he had an incredible life, but so he is now in Saigon during the main part of the war. Quang continues to sort of agitate for Buddhist rights. He also is constantly critical of the government because the Ang Quang Buddhists, for example, want a negotiated settlement to the war. They want a neutralist government. Now, they're not pro-communist. This is important. Quang and his other fellows don't actually support the communists. They just want the war to end, right? So that's their sort of political position. Now you see here, I love this photo, by the way, because I just think it's so expressive. These two guys, again, know each other from way back. I mean, you can see the intimacy here, almost like someone courting a shy maiden, Quang's looking away. Well, this was a sit-down protest that Quang and some of his people had staged outside the presidential palace in Saigon because they were, again, agitating for more Buddhist rights. Monsoon rains came early that year. So no one else basically shows up and they are drowning like rats. And this is, Lewan goes here with his umbrella. It's like, dude, come on, just go home. We can work this out. So he just convinced Quang to end the protests, and they actually do broker. Lewan helps broker a sort of peace deal with the governments. The Ang Quang Buddhists are actually not so outspokenly anti-government anymore. And this is September 1967. Okay. So we talked about the Ang Quang Pagoda. Well, the one that's in the middle, the one thing that's still standing. This is after the Tet Offensive, so it gives you some idea of what was going on in Saigon during the time. But the Ang Quang Pagoda again, was in Saigon sort of the most politically outspoken of the Buddhist movements. And this is where on Tet Kwang, Tet mean venerable, because he was a monk. That's where he was based. And like I said, the Angkor Pagoda, the Angkor Buddhists, even though they're politically active, were not in league with the communists. So part of how I began to untangle this story, there are always things about it that bug me. I mean, going decades back. But for some of you who as a digital historian, I do a lot of things like geospatial work. So what this is actually a 1 to 10,000 map of Saigon that I enhanced with Photoshop and then skinned on Google Earth, right? So I can see what it looked like back in 1968, and I've identified some of the important areas that I'll refer to as I discuss the points. So, point 1, Luan executed the notorious VC sapper Baylop. Horsepucky. Not true. Why do I know that? Well, there are multiple Vietnam post-war histories written by the Vietnamese People's Army that tell us very clearly Baylop was killed on the morning of 31 January at the South Vietnamese Navy headquarters. You see here on the river, like a whole day before this Luan execution. So Baylop leads an attack and is killed. Now, Baylop, again, that's his alias. His real name is Nguyen Van Lem. If you do Vietnam War, you become very familiar with aliases. Baylop means something like 7 tires. So it's usually like brother 10 or cousin 12, that's why you see those names. But he was killed, and this is, beyond a shadow of a doubt. So clearly, I'm thinking, no, that wasn't Baylop that Luan killed, all right? So who was it? The true identity appears to be a person named Lê Khang Na. Lê Khang Na was a VC political operative in District 5 in the center of, you see there by the Angkor Pagoda, the old Cholan district, the Chinese district. So he was part of the Saigon Jia Din Party Committee that ran the city. And his job in District 5 was to organize political activities and covert operations in that part of the city. He was not a sapper. He was not part of the F-100 group. He was totally, part of the same overall organization, but doing a very different job. And part of the reason that we sort of discovered his identity is, see, if you go to for example, the Wikipedia page in English and look at this, it says, Luan killed Baylop, yada, yada, yada. But if you go to the Vietnamese wiki page, different story, right? Run by different people, different language. And there they say, well, yes, some people originally thought it was Baylop, but in fact, it's Lê Khang Na because like half a dozen people, including his own brother, came forward later to say, yeah, that's who it was. So again, sometimes you have to go, find the right evidence. Okay, second point, Baylop or Na, whoever, assassinated between 7 and 34 innocent people. Again, this happened up in the suburb of Go Vap, which is on the edge of Tan Son Nhut, up to the 5 kilometers to the north, not even actually in the city itself. Again, couldn't be because we know Baylop was dead, so it wasn't him. Was it Na? And also almost impossible to believe that that was the case, partly because the communist forces up in Go Vap belonged to a completely different headquarters, had their own operational zone. There was no overlap. Na was the political commissar in the middle of the city. And just to imagine him trying to get the checkpoints to rush north, assassinate these people, come back just in time to get arrested and killed. The timeline doesn't work. Just that alone. In fact, we haven't quite figured out who the perpetrators are. The family of the armor commander, Lieutenant Colonel Nguyen Tuan, was in fact assassinated. And most of his family was assassinated in Go Vap by communist forces. We don't know exactly who they were. So that happened. And the communists did have assassination squads. That's true. It just not the people like Na or Bela. Some of you know this, interesting side note, the 9-year-old boy was the only one to survive of Tuan's family. He was shot 3 times and lay there with his mother who eventually bled out. Tuan came to the United States and became a rear admiral in the US Navy. He just retired a few weeks ago, but he served down at the Navy Yard. So he was so inspired by the Navy's efforts to rescue the people in '75 that he joined. So again, he's still around, and you know, thoughts to him for what he saw and endured. Okay, third point. So again, this idea that Bela or not killed the family of Tuan. Like I said, certainly wasn't Bela, and doesn't seem to be Na, because again, Na had a completely different job, had no reason to be in that part of town. And in fact, if you know anything about the communists, they are really strict on operational zones and span of control. I mean, it'd be sort of like, I don't know, someone in, you know, the Los Angeles Police Department deciding that they're going to go to Denver and start arresting people. Like, no, not your jurisdiction. You've got a different job. So there's no evidence that Na assassinated anybody. Certainly not Tuan's family. Who did it? We're still digging on that. Fourth, that Bela or Na bragged about killing those people. Again, zero evidence, and there's no blood on their clothing, Na's clothing. In fact, I'll show you in a minute. It seems that Na basically said nothing the entire time he was under arrest. That story of bragging emerges later, like so many other details. Finally, the claim that Luan, after killing Na, tells Adams, oh, that was Bela, and he killed family, and that's why. Again, no. The evidence at the time is very clear. At the time, it's reported Luan turned to Adams and said, they killed many of my people and yours too, and walked away. That's what he said. And nothing about that person, or he wasn't even angry. He just did it. So again, all those points just don't, you know, they don't hold together. So again, that was putting me on the trail. And then if you look at, these are the sequence of photos that Eddie Adams took, right? Going through. Now, usually, you know, you've seen the one where he actually kills Na, right? Everyone's seen that. But you don't see the other ones as much. And me being a digital guy, and as you know, being kind of obsessed with photographs and digitally restoring photos and finding details, I went and looked at each of those photos. And one of the things that really sparked my interest is I found, again, in Vietnamese language site, a South Vietnamese Marine who gave a first-person account of tackling and capturing Na, right? And so his account, when I began to read, I'm like, oh, that makes sense. So I'm looking at these photos for confirmation, and I'll show you, sure enough. So one of the things this Marine said, when this guy popped out of the pagoda, he tried to jump on a bike and race away. So they tackled him, put his arms behind his back. He had on him a red VC armband, K-54 pistol, and a piece of paper. What do you see there? Off camera, handing an armband. And you see the other lieutenant holding it by the barrel. That's a K-54 pistol and a piece of paper. So this is like a minute after they tackled him. I mean, these happened really quickly. Bicycle, sitting propped up on the street right there. I mean, again, I can't be sure that was the bicycle, but it seems likely given the fact that they said, you know, he tried to jump on a bicycle and hit away. And so, you know, I thought that was another interesting, you know, bit of information that seemed to corroborate what the Marine said. So again, they march him down the street. They're signaling to Luan, who's about a block away. There's one of his lieutenants signaling to Luan. This is completely aside, but those of you who are into weapons, notice they're carrying like everything under the sun. an Uzi but there, I'm looking at for all these details. So he's signaling and walking down the street. And that's probably the second most famous photo. And you see he's got the, pistol in his hand, and he's, talking in his ear. Look at Na. This is not a defiant guy. This is not someone who's bragged about killing people. Also, no blood on him that, I can certainly see. Also, this is one of the things that bugged me, like, from ever. He's not dressed like a sapper. Sappers were dressed like office workers, long pants, because they were basically secret agent. This guy, what is he dressed like? A cyclo driver. The people who pedal around, the bicycles ferrying people, short pants. Adults did not wear short pants in Vietnam unless you had a very good reason, right? So just the way he dressed was wrong. Also, if you're an assassin, like, where's the ammo belt? Where's your extra? This is not someone who has the appearance of an assassin. Again, assassins did exist, just didn't seem like this guy. And then, of course, the photo captured, at the moment the bullet enters his head. Now, again, you can see there's a short video, and it's interesting. They walk down the street. They walk up to General Lewan. General Lewan gives them an ups and down. Someone's saying, hey, we captured this guy. He's got a pistol, looks at him. Like 5 seconds elapses. And then he pulls it, waves him off. Bang. Simple, as quick as that. No anger from Lewan, no recognition, no, oh, that's the guy, you SOB. No, none of that. None of that. And then I thought this is, this is a still from the film. This is a South Vietnamese photographer placing that red armband on Na after he's dead in order to take a picture of this. Now, when Lewan shoots him, there are at least 4 photographers standing right there with their cameras. One of them, Eddie taking photos, the video running, and 2 others. This is not like, I'm gonna shoot this. No, this is like, all right, you guys ready? You ready? Boom. This is a bit of speculation, but I'm digging on this. I think this is a statement. I am the sheriff of this town, and this is what happens to the VC. A critical point of the VC is they're trying to create a popular uprising within Saigon and other cities. Their attacks will fail if they don't do that, right? So, he's making a statement. And I also think that, again, I have to look into this, but knowing what I know about Lewan, no hat, no helmet. He wants this to be clear. This is him. He wants people to know he's not afraid. He is, boom, Main Street. This is what happens. The people who, try to pull this in my city. And then finally, you look at the different angles. This is another sort of, nail in the coffin, so to speak. I know the Viet Cong codes they use for Tet, because I read about a gazillion captured Viet Cong documents. And so if you decipher the code, what you see is this is an armband worn by someone who is operating as a liaison to the Sub-Region 2 headquarters. What does that all mean? Well, the Ang Quang Pagoda, an element from the 6th VC Battalion, had occupied the pagoda on the first day of the offensive. And they flew VC banners or NLF banners from the pagoda, trying to make people think that the Ang Quang Buddhists supported them, right? This element of the 6th Bintan Battalion was trying to get to the prison to liberate the prisoners, but they didn't know where they were going. So they got surrounded, captured. Na was trying to flee that encirclement and go back to the rest of the battalion down by the racetrack and let them know what happened. So that armband is basically his safe conduct pass. That's like, I'm the liaison between, District 5 and this 6th Battalion. So again, confirming what this South Vietnamese Marine said. Okay, so where does this lead us? Well, how did this myth, and which is layers of myth, begin? And I'm not going to go through all the details because there's a lot and we don't have all the answers. When I say we, I'm working with a New York filmmaker, Douglas Sloan, and a researcher named An Nguyen on a documentary that will get to the bottom of this thing. I also intend to write a book about it, a companion book, but at any rate, so we're going to be doing more work in this. But part of the answer is, you see there on the left, that was a New York Times, 2 February 1968. The first time the photo was, put out there. And I think part of the reason where this sort of confusion happens is you've got the juxtaposition of the Adams photo above with a photo below, which shows an armor officer at that compound holding his dead child. Now, that's not Colonel Twan, but that was Colonel Twan's fellow officer, I think. Point is, if you look at the caption down there on the bottom, it talks about Twan and the assassination of his family. So I think at an early point, these two events became conflated with one another. And this is part of the reason. There are other factors going into it. The Twan family execution was huge news in Saigon at the time, in the way that the Luan Na photo didn't even register, but people in Saigon were aware of the Twan. So at an early stage, I think the two things became conflated. And that is going to be one of the challenges, just to finally, get down to patient zero, like where did this idea begin? But again, we know it wasn't Bailoff. We're almost entirely positive it was not. And I think the sequence shows that the story is very different, very interesting. I'm not trying to justify what Luan did. I'm just saying it wasn't what we thought it was. And that's important, right? It should be. All right, second event, attack on the US Embassy. People have heard of that. So this is the embassy before the attack. In fact, it was opened in September 67 after the older one downtown, had gotten bombed before and wasn't very secure. So this is state of the art, right? A couple blocks from the presidential palace. You see that that sort of lattice work outside the building. That's actually a rocket screen, the white on the outside. So the building is inside that white. The white is to absorb mortars and rockets. That's why they designed it that way. But again, they designed the building to withstand standoff attacks. It wasn't really designed to do like an infantry or sapper assault. So what is the dominant narrative of the embassy attack? Probably something like 19 Viet Cong sappers attacked the embassy on the morning of 31, broke into the embassy, and remained there for several hours until the United States counterattacked and killed all 19 of the sappers. That's broad, and you see this in a lot of the accounts of the time, in even Wikipedia. Okay. So again, this is just to orient you. This is a zoom in on my Google Earth map, just to give you an idea of, where the embassy is in relation to, say, the presidential palace, about 3 blocks down. And across the street is the UK embassy. French embassy is close by. The Southeast police station is actually right behind the American embassy. And this is a front view. Again, you can get a better idea of the lattice. And you see, and the point I want to bring here is that part of the confusion stems from what we mean by the word embassy. Is the embassy compound, which is the lot is upon with the outer wall. The Chancery building, the 6th floor building you see in the middle, that is the actual embassy. But there is part of a compound that has a complex off to the left that does a lot of administrative things. And if you look in the back, for that villa, for example, that's where the mission coordinator lived, George Jacobson, parking and stuff. So it's actually bigger than the embassy. So sometimes when people say the embassy, they broke into the embassy. Again, it's a little confusing because they didn't actually break into the embassy. What happened? I think this is from Osprey. I'm just going to say, CMH, we need to start doing isometric 3D maps like this. I love them. This just kind of shows the sequence of events, but in brief, what actually happens is 15 Viet Cong sappers from the F-100 group roll up in a pair of vehicles, get out. Part of the group tries to go around to the side gate, where the vehicles go in. Two American MPs are there, see them slam the gate shut. So they can't get in that way. The other group goes to the corner, plants satchel charges, boom, blows a hole in there, right? And then goes inside. And there's a view of, you see the hole in the embassy wall. Well, talk about leadership. First two in, commander and his XO, which is great for leadership, but probably a bad idea in this case because the two MPs see him shoot them. So the CO is dead instantly, and the XO, Zhang, is so badly wounded he passes out. Oopsie. This is partly this problem because only half of these sappers are actually sappers. They had to find more bodies at the last moment because they weren't even going to attack the embassy. This was a late decision. Some of these guys are like cooks, so they don't know what's going on. So they crawl in there, right? And they're like, so now what? And you see they end up taking positions behind those planters and stuff. And they just kind of hunker down. They do fire a couple RPGs at the screen and one at the front door, but basically they're just waiting around. By the way, see these two M16s, those are the two MP guards that were defending. A embassy driver, apparently, who was a VC agent, comes from behind the parking lot, kills those two MPs. So they do seem to have had an inside person. Another thing I find interesting, if you look at the footage, you notice that there's actually a bunch of these B-40 rockets laying around that they didn't use. So they fired a few up, but they had a lot more. And why that's interesting is, this is a still from a video. They fired one at the front door, and you see it, it didn't knock the whole thing down, but it certainly blew a hole through it. If they just fired one or two more, they would have gotten into the building, and they had more. So what's going on? They actually didn't plan on getting in the building. That was not the objective. It was not to occupy the building or anything else. It was to occupy the grounds, because they were waiting for a bunch of university students to show up and stage a sit-down strike. That's what they're waiting for. And they're also waiting for a VC battalion to come across the river and relieve them. So that was their mission. It wasn't to take the embassy. So again, we go, how does this idea begin? Well, for example, the 19 dead VC, so the early accounts usually mention the 19 dead VC, and then it gets repeated verbatim. Well, we know that's not true because we have interrogation reports for the three guys who lived. So this is the XO who got whacked going through the hole, who later gave extended testimony. So we and the other two, Sao and San, gave interrogation reports. So we have a very good idea what they're up to. We know it was 15 and all that other stuff. Did any of you see The Greatest Beer Run Ever? The movie on Apple that just... Okay, well, if enough of you had said yes, I would have made a side note. Anyway, but it's watch it. So in the second point here is that, for example, is often described as a suicide squad. No, it wasn't a suicide squad. They were not expecting to all die. They were waiting for those students to show up. Part of the reason students didn't show up, that protest that Chich Tweak Krang did in September, government is like, no more protests, curfew. So the students, and also being students, come on. They're not going to, show up at 3 a.m. They're not going to do that. So it never happened. The VC never, that's why they got overrun, but it was not a suicide squad. Okay, third and final episode, the Walter Cronkite story. All right, so it goes something like this. When Walter Cronkite gave his editorial on air in late February, he essentially helped turn or shift public opinion. Like, that was the turning point. Cronkite basically said, we can't win this war, we might as well leave, and public opinion shifted, and whatever hope we had of succeeding went away out. That's sort of the in a nutshell. So what's the backstory? Well, okay, Walter Cronkite travels to the city of Wei, which was scene of, a month-long fighting during the Tet Offensive. It's a beautiful city, walled citadel, but some of the nastiest urban combat of the 20th century. So he went in person and, well, to show you, I actually built this thing in 3D. So I built the city using a 3D SketchUp tool, so you can actually look at it. You can see the elevation, the walls, and everything. The point I want to make here is that you see the outer walls and stuff, but then all the water. So basically, it was in the city. So it was a nightmare to try to fight through. And this is part of the reason it took a whole month for the Allies to recapture it. This is a bit of a sidebar, but it's worth doing. Again, this is an example of the Marines going through the citadel around the middle of the month. They're attacking toward the Dongba Tower. And me being me, I do this weird photo spatial analysis thing where I'm looking at different photos and trying to figure out, okay, what tank is that? What angle are we looking at? And so I was in trying to figure out some details. And that kind of led me down a road where you may have seen this famous photo John Olson took. Mark Bowden writes about this, of course, in his book Way. And you see the mortally wounded Marine there on the front. And Bowden says in his book, this is, a so-and-so Marine who in fact survived the battle. And here he is, and he gave his testimony, powerful picture, but wrong. New York Times did an investigative story. I did my own investigation. At any rate, long story short, it wasn't Alvin Grantham that Bowden says it was. It was James Blaine on the left here. So I just did a little collage because I figured out what the tank number was, found the records for the tank, did a facial analysis, a bunch of other things. So at any rate, that's another side myth that needs to be corrected. But using all of this, so the point of this is that, Way was this really terrible, prolonged battle. Cronkite goes and visits Way during the battle. See here, he's doing a spot shoot. Now, some people say, "Oh, Cronkite, what a lightweight." He's going there to try to seem like he's all tough guy. This is a guy who flew combat missions in World War II in B-17s. So, all right, stop right there. I don't want to hear it. Cronkite was not some, liberal, lightweight, peacenik or whatever. I mean, this is a guy who'd been there, done that. So he goes and he sees and he talks to people and, okay, so he doesn't appear there. It's fine. Imagine him on, I actually had a video clip, but it wasn't going to run in this, but I will read you the relevant section. I think this is important because people think, they know about the Cronkite story, but have you actually seen the segment? I mean, go back and watch it, and I'll just read what I think is it's not long, but this is the critical part. This is him. To say that we are closer to victory today is to believe, in the face of evidence, the optimists who have been wrong in the past. To suggest that we are on the edge of defeat is to yield to unreasonable pessimism. To say that we are mired in stalemate seems the only realistic yet unsatisfactory conclusion. And he was right. He did not say we're going to lose the war or we should leave or anything else. In fact, the next second he says, the next 6 months will kind of demonstrate whether we can achieve, a favorable leverage position negotiating table. He's not saying we're done, it's all doom and gloom. He's just saying, all the people I talk to, all the things I've seen, we're not going to win tomorrow. Gosh, he was right. Again, sometimes people do, he turned American public opinion. There's even a story of, Johnson, we lost Walter Cronkite, we've lost Middle America. That story is also disputed. May have happened, may have not happened. Whether Johnson said a lot of things. I just don't think that again, it wasn't the turning point. I think what Cronkite said actually made a lot of sense. And so I think, we just go back and look at the original evidence. And sometimes you could be surprised. So I would like to leave it there and open the floor for questions in the time that we have remaining. Yes.
The young Marine on the back of the tank.
Yep.
Just recently, I live in southern Delaware, near Rehoboth, Lucas area. And they ran a front page story on the Cape Gazette about that young man. It turned out he didn't die. He actually tracked down the doctor that treated him after he was evacuated. The doctor lives, still alive. He lives in Rehoboth Beach,
Mhm.
and the two of them met just recently.
Are you talking about Alan Grantham on the right there?
I am not sure, I forgot.
That, oh, and the reason I say this is I have expended a lot of time and sweat on this. That is not him.
Well,
Okay, now Alan Grantham, just to
go ahead.
point being here, he was there in the Citadel. He did fight. He was wounded, and he probably was even evacuated, possibly on a tank, possibly on a mule. None of that is debated. But that is not the person in that particular image on the tank. That's all I'm saying is that, and it's important to me because think about the family of James Blaine. Okay. Yeah.
The person that actually sought out, I'm trying to remember the doctor's last name.
Mm-hmm.
He was an Army doctor.
Yeah.
The gentleman, Marine, whoever he was
Mm-hmm.
evacuated to an
Dubai,
Army.
probably.
Yeah, it was an Army surgical hospital
Mm-hmm.
where he was. The doctor always wanted to know who was this Marine.
Yep.
And just recently, when that came up, because everybody thought he died. Is it true? Is it not true? This is where historical evidence, actual documentation.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, there it all is. It's all there. We can't always believe everything we say. Steve. I should say.
Yes, although I will throw down on that point all day long. I mean,
Okay.
believe me, this is like tip of the iceberg because we've tracked down other people on that tank at that time.
Okay.
We have the documentation from that time from the tank. I'm just saying,
I would love to talk to you afterwards. I will give you the information.
excellent.
So
Because
you
I'm
can see
always
it.
wanting to.
Okay,
Yeah.
thank you very
Yeah.
much.
Thank you, sir. My unit, 3rd Battalion, 7th Infantry, was at the Futo racetrack.
Mm-hmm.
And we had a New York Times reporter with us, which I accompanied to the field for 2 days. And his name was Joseph Treaster. And Treaster then had 4 days of above the fold front page articles in the New York Times. And I was a student at the Armed Forces Staff College, and I decided to study the disconnection between the reporting and the editorializing.
Mm-hmm.
And what happens is after 4 days of the New York Times front page by Treaster, which I researched and told everyone it was accurate,
Yeah.
on about the 7th day, the editorial director, James Reston, started opining based on what Cronkite reported about one city, not the whole country, but just one city. But he made it sound like we are doomed in Vietnam,
Right.
whereas in Saigon, the VC were just wiped out. In fact, on that same operation I took Treaster on,
Yeah.
the 3rd of the 7th killed the Major General VC who was running the Saigon attack. So
Yeah.
the New York Times got it totally wrong, and they used Cronkite to
Right.
boost them.
So Cronkite actually, he visited way in the second half of February. So the first up in his broadcasts through that time actually were, not doom and gloom. We're more sort of supportive, I guess, more like, hey, we're actually knocking the stuffings out of them. And by the way, the unit you were fighting, that's the 6th Bintan Battalion. Those are the same folks who sent people up to the Angkor Pagoda. And yes, that was a nasty fight. But yeah, the 199th, just, yeah, you steamrolled it. And that went on for, as you know, like 12 days. I mean, they kept feeding people in. So, and also the account of the Major General, turns out Interesting. Because I researched this, there were reports at the time that he had been killed. He wasn't. The 199 did basically annihilate the 6th Bintan Battalion. I mean, they went in with 300 and got reinforced with at least that many during the battle. They walked out with 30. So they, got the worst end of that deal. But yes, part of the problem is, reporters will go to where they can go, safe enough to go, and also, where the sort of the most smoke and noise and explosion. So you have a lot of coverage of like the embassy, for example, and Way, but not coverage of other things. So I think, yeah, the point being, yes, first accounts, first blush of history, always have to be a little careful because you're not getting the full picture. Yes.
Thank you for your presentation. I think I'm at least viewing this as a microcosm of our involvement in Vietnam, at least in the way it was delivered to the public. And perhaps like all cultures, we like complex ideas delivered to us in tidy bundles.
Yeah.
Ideally, maybe even fitting on a bumper sticker. But I think the backstory to your backstories, which I haven't heard you express, unless I missed it, is what was referred to as the 5 o'clock follies for the media, which were the briefings delivered by American military headquarters in Saigon most days at the end of the day, which were apparently spun all the time to only provide a positive image. And therefore, what you're showing could then be delivered by the media as the real story.
So, no, I am quite familiar with that. In fact, my former colleague, Bill Hammond, wrote an excellent 2-volume study of the military and the media that CMH published. Barry Zorthian, the Geospatial head, who coordinated the 5 o'clock follies. I think it's fair to say that the 5 o'clock follies, as they say, contributed to a increasing loss of confidence in the accuracy of what was being said, because as you note, the tendency is to report the good news sometimes at the expense of the bad, or at least to deliver information in a way that's sort of so antiseptic that it's sort of sucked dry of meaning. Light casualties were taken by what does that mean? So I think, yes, there is a bigger backstory to the whole climate. And again, don't have time here to get into the role of the media and stuff, although I would love to do that when that's appropriate or even in private. But yes, there is, it's fair to say that Tet Offensive happened at a point when the sort of, credibility gap was really beginning to widen, and this did not help that at all. And the things that I've discovered, again, when I'm not trying to say, is to justify anyone's behavior, to say that these people the journalists got it wrong. I mean, the journalists were doing what they could. Oftentimes it takes a long time before you can sort of really drill down to what maybe is closer to the original truth. Yeah, question. Yeah.
Yeah. With General Loan, what it really sounds like is you've got a clash of cultures, and Dr. Maas, correct me if I'm wrong on this. One of the frustrations that the militias had and the early European settlers had with the Native Americans was if the Americans did something to if the European settlers did something to the Native Americans, the natives didn't really care to get the person who did it, but it was just the nearest European settler who happened to be there would wind up getting killed.
Yeah.
And what it sounds like is that's what happened to this poor, driver, driver, but that that was not acceptable to the American mind and psychology. Therefore, they had to put it within their culture of putting it back to a specific incident
Yeah.
that happened.
Right.
And
And I think I think that is part of this, the myth story, as you say. I agree, because like General Lewan, he said a number of things and sometimes contradictory things afterward. One of the reasons he said reason he killed him was this was a VC agent dressed like a civilian
right.
and carrying a weapon. And so sort of, Geneva Accords, well, he's not uniformed. And so why? But part of it too was, and this always drove me nuts. If this was Baylock, if this was Moriarty, right, in Sherlock Holmes, and you capture Moriarty, you don't just kill him. You interrogate that person. They know, and part of the
No.
reason that he kills him so quickly is he realized he's a virtual nobody.
Yeah.
And so differing standards, cultural standards can play into it. But I think soon afterwards, as the blowback happened, I think there was a tendency to, well, okay, wait a minute. Oh, that's Baylock, who did all these other horrible things, and therefore he had it come to
Yeah, You're trying to justify
right.
a different culture with your own
yeah.
standards. Now, as far as Cronkite goes, that's very interesting. Now, Winchi Than was talking about when the Americans first came. One of the biggest things that he said, and I think it was his third point from what I was reading,
Mhm.
is we have got to work on the country much like they did with the French to get back then. So even though I saw Cronkite say that, and it is
Yeah.
a very neutral statement,
Yeah.
but what was already going on, the backstory was that the Vietnamese were working within our academia and within our media, and it got changed really, really
Yeah.
quickly.
Well, and this will be another discussion, another time that I hope we can have about that. So the short answer is the Vietnamese communists were, yes, aware of and interested in, undermining American support for the war, no matter what they did. However, on the list of their priorities, yeah, it was not at the top. The top one, and again, we're talking Tet Offensive here particularly, is decapitating the South Vietnamese government, right? That was their point. So yes, influencing American public always going to be a part of the strategy. No question about that. To the extent that it made a difference, we can have that discussion.
We're going to have to leave it there for now. I'm sure Eric would love to talk to you. Let's have a round of applause for Erik Villard. Thank you so much, Eric.